We're going to start off today talking about loving people. That is the mission of this church. We're here to love God, love people, and serve both well. Specifically today, we're looking at the battle to love. There's very much so things that come in the way between you and loving your community. And so we're gonna kind of look at that today. We'll be mostly in 2 Samuel chapter 11. Now, if you grew up in church, there's going to be some stories that are just well known to you. This isn't going to apply if you didn't grow up in the church, but if you grew up going to Sunday school and stuff, there's going to be just some stories that you've heard so many times, and you kind of get to them in the Bible and just kind of breeze through them because you've heard them so many times. So for those of you who did grow up in church, maybe if I say the flood, you already know where it is in the Bible. You've read it 100 times. You're already over it, right? Or if I say David and Goliath, oh, you've heard that one. You've probably read a bunch of inspirational books about it. You've probably heard it referenced in pop culture. You've probably, it's just all over the place. You've probably heard it talked about in Sunday school. Or when we say David and Bathsheba, for a lot of people that's going to be like, okay, well, I know about this. And the problem is that familiarity breeds contempt. And what I mean by that is you stop paying attention to things when they're familiar. So we're actually going to look at a story today that is very well known if you grew up in the church. It's the one about David and Bathsheba. But we're going to slow down and actually look at some very important details. And the main gist of the story is at the beginning of 2 Samuel chapter 11. It says this in verses 2 through 5. It says, "One evening, David got up from his bed and strolled around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing, a very beautiful woman." Getting kind of creepy. So David sent someone to inquire about her, and he said, "Isn't this Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" David sent messengers to get her, and when she came to him, he slept with her. Now, she had just been purifying herself from her uncleanness. This is all kinds of awkward, I tell you what. Afterwards, she returned home. The woman conceived and sent word to inform David, "I am pregnant." Ooh, boy. So then we hop down to verses 14 and 16. There's some more stuff that happens. We're not really going to talk about it today. It says in verses 14 through 16, "The next morning David wrote a letter to Joab, who is the commander of David's armies, and sent it with Uriah, who's the husband of the woman that he just committed an affair with." Keep that in mind, very important detail. And the letter he wrote, "Put Uriah at the front of the fiercest fighting, then withdraw from him so that he is struck down and dies." Boy, this just keeps getting more and more awkward, doesn't it? When Joab was besieging the city, he put Uriah in the place where he knew the best enemy soldiers were. So, okay, this story, there's so many different things going wrong. It's just, I don't think we can say this is the thing that David did wrong. It's like a series of things. And so, David is the only person in the Bible who it specifically says, this is a man after God's own heart, right? This is that guy that's doing this to Uriah. This is that same guy. Just so we're all on the same page. And there's a very important question that I think is worth asking. How in the world did David get here? How do you, the only person who is said of is a man after God's own heart, get to the point of this? Because you know, if you've got a heart after God, that surely means that you treat people very well, right? Isn't that like one of the things about loving God? You would think. So what on earth happened? Now, teachers, when they talk about this, they typically point to verse 1, and this is what they say. I'll read the verse, and I'll kind of say what they typically say. "In the spring, when kings march out to war, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem." And so typically when teachers bring up this verse, they ask this. They say, or they don't ask this, they say this: he had no business being there. He shouldn't have been at the palace. And then they say, their main point is that when we slack off, when we go where we aren't supposed to go, we get tempted when we put ourselves in those situations. And that's not necessarily wrong, but a bigger question that I think is not answered is, why was he there in the first place? Why was David at the palace instead of at war? It's a very important question, but we don't typically look at that. We just look at, well, he shouldn't have been there. Now, hold on. Hear what I'm saying. This is his palace where he lives. You can't avoid your home. Right? See what I'm saying? Like, eventually, he would have been in a situation, right? I mean, he wasn't going to be at war 24/7. So, yes, it is true that he should have been at war. A bigger question is, why was he not at war? Why was he not there? Why did he send his troops and not go himself? Well, the problem actually starts way back in 1 Samuel. This is why it's important to read stories together. You have to read what's before it and after it, because there's a whole long thing that's happening, and it builds up to 2 Samuel 11. So if we hop back to 1 Samuel, it starts out with David marrying his first wife. Not necessarily a problem yet, okay. Saul gave his daughter, Saul is the king before David, gave his daughter Michal to David as his wife, okay? So we've got that setting up, and then we go to the next couple chapters down. It's about 7 or so chapters later. When David's servants came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, David sent us to bring you to him as a wife. So he's getting another wife. So he's been chased out of his home. Okay, all right. It's understandable. Bad situation. Okay. And there's some other things going on here. But this woman, her husband was just killed. And so David kind of swoops in to take her. And then you get a couple verses later, and it says this in verses 43 through 44. David also married Ahinoam of Jezreel, and the two of them became his wives. Okay. But Saul gave his daughter Michal, David's wife, to Palti. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff happening. He's away from home, so Saul just kind of cancels out the deal and gives his wife to somebody else. Kind of questionable as to whether that's actually legal, but I mean, Samuel kind of did warn them that the king would do this kind of stuff, so they shouldn't have been overly surprised. So in David's sojourning, he gets these two other wives. So things are getting a little bit weird, and this is questionable whether this is right for David to do this. I know that back then, polygamy was legal. I understand that. The Bible oftentimes records people in being in polygamous relationships. It never condones it, but it does record it. And I'm sorry, yeah, I said that right. It doesn't condone it, but it records it. But it's still questionable whether this was okay for David to do, because David has already been anointed as the future king of Israel. So he already knows what's coming. And if you look back in the law, it says this in Deuteronomy 17, he must not acquire many wives for himself, so his heart won't go astray. So David's kind of breaking that one. Okay, and you could say, well, the king took away his wife, so he remarried. Okay, all right. That kind of explains one wife. I don't think it explains two wives. And that's still a little bit questionable because, wouldn't you want to wait for your wife? That'd be the ideal, I would hope. But, okay, so let's move on. And it says now we get to 2 Samuel again, chapter 3, and it says this. Then David sent messengers to say to Ishbosheth, son of Saul, give me back my wife, Michal. And then you hop down to the next verse, and it says, so Ishbosheth sent someone to take her away from her husband, Paltiel, son of Laish. Her husband followed her, weeping all the way to Bahurim. This is an awkward situation all the way around. So he had this wife who was the king's daughter. She was taken from the king, given to somebody else. Later, he says, yeah, I want her back, even though I already have these other two wives. Okay? Oh, okay. So he goes and gets her, and the whole time his new husband is following her walking, crying. Eesh. This is just awkward one way, and this is also questionable, because here's the thing. David didn't actually divorce Michal, okay, but it says in Jeremiah and the law, this is all over the place, it says, if a man divorces his wife and she leaves him to marry another, can he ever return to her? Wouldn't such a land become totally defiled? So although David didn't necessarily divorce her from choice, it's still a bit of a gray area. Still a bit of a gray area, especially since she was remarried. It's just, at best, it's awkward. At best. And so that kind of takes us, I think, now we can actually look at the battle to love people. Because here we have 4 problems at least that we face in our battle to love people. The first one, okay, confidence in who you were blinds you to who you're becoming. And the reason for this is because you don't try for what you already are. Right? If I'm a father, I don't have to try to be a father. Right? I already am one. Right? It already happened. If I'm married, I don't have to be a husband. I'm already married. If I'm a Christian, I don't have to get saved again. I'm already a Christian. I'm already there. When you are something, you don't work for it. If you're good at your job, you don't say, hey, I need to become good at my job. you're already good at your job. You might get better, you might improve, but that doesn't mean that you have to start over from the beginning. But for David was after God's heart before, and so he didn't see that he was becoming after women's hearts. See, because he already was the man after God's own heart, so he didn't have to worry about it anymore. I'm already the man after God's own heart. So now he starts doing things that are not after God's own heart. And it's okay because that's who I was, right? He had confidence in who he was. Take David's son, for instance, King Solomon. This guy is known, everybody knows King Solomon the wisest person, right? Not the wisest person to ever have lived, but the wisest person. Okay, so for instance, Jesus lived on earth, right? I think Jesus was wiser than Solomon. Okay, so he wasn't all time forever the wisest because God has that place. But still, you have King Solomon the wise. Okay, very wise, wiser than anybody else. And some very interesting things happen with Solomon, and at the end of his life, he starts doing some very unwise things. Why? Because he didn't have to worry about it. I'm already wise. I don't have to worry about how I'm living my life. I can do unwise, stupid things, and it's okay. See, you don't protect that area that you think you're strong in. You see that? So your confidence in who you were blinds you to who you're becoming, and you see this happen a lot. For instance, why is it so easy? This is not a jab at people here, okay? So don't go crazy with this. Why is it so easy for prayer chains to become gossip chains? Because Satan is able to attack us where we don't defend ourselves. Well, I'm good with prayer, so then it starts getting into gossip, and it's okay. Another example: why is it so easy for marriages to suddenly fail? Oh, we have a good, strong marriage. Are you feeding it? Are you growing it? Or are you living on how it was yesterday? We do this all over with all the different areas of our life. Well, and you ever get to the point where you say, well, I used to be patient. What happened? Well, life happened and you lost your patience, didn't you? Because your confidence in yesterday is not going to carry you forward. Your confidence in who you were blinds you to who you're becoming. Ever notice that a lot of times the people who are used by God the most become hardest of heart? It happens to us, doesn't it? If you've been in ministry or the church long, you know what happens. You have to constantly be vigilant because your heart goes astray. Why is it so easy when you love worship to get to a place where you can't stand people? Have you ever gotten there? Oh, I love worship, I love God, I just can't stand people. How did you get there? How did you get there? Because that's who you were yesterday. And your confidence from who you were is blinding you to who you're becoming. We never stop to ask, am I still submitted to God? I remember when I was younger, I made all these promises to God. God, I'll never do this. God, I'll never do that. Well, then when I got older, I forgot those promises because life happened. So it was easy for me to say, I think I'm going to do this. And then God gently reminded me, ever so gently, don't you remember what you said years ago? Is your life still submitted to me or not? And when you get to that place, you're living off yesterday. And that's not good enough for who God has you for in the future, what God has you for in the future. When you get to the place of, oh, I used to seek God, and now do you still seek God? I used to be in ministry, but now I'm just stagnant. My ministry is stagnant. I used to love people, now I'm just kind of, they're there. They're there. Unwatched, our love will always fade. When we don't pay attention to what's going on in our heart, it always fades. And it'll happen even quicker if you're in a bad situation. When you get to a bad situation, it happens even faster. You get hurt. It always happens like this. You get hurt somewhere. Doesn't matter where, but you get hurt somewhere. And then your hurt goes and it turns into anger. So you get mad. Show me a person with anger issues. Typically, they're hurt. Typically. Not always, but typically. Then after the madness has gone its course, you get to bitterness. So you don't wake up one day and you're bitter. You wake up one day and you get hurt. And then you get mad, and then you get bitter. And it takes years, and you don't even realize who you've become because you still remember who you were. I used to be patient. I used to love people. For David, he got to this point very gradually. But David had uncontrolled lust from his younger years that spiraled and grew. which is what sin always does. I mean, think about when you have a bad attitude. You don't wake up one day and have a bad attitude, right? You used to be a loving, gentle, kind person, and then you just turn into a grumpy complainer. It didn't happen overnight. It kind of built over time. But the story gets worse, because when we hop over to 1 Chronicles, we get a very interesting detail about David and his relationship with Uriah. Not Bathsheba, but Uriah. The following were the chiefs of David's warriors who, together with all Israel, strongly supported him in his reign to make him king according to the Lord's word. Okay, so these are going to be the top of the top. And they're broken down into two groups. There's the three of the top, so the top of the top of the top, and then there's the 30 top, okay? So then it mentions the three, and it goes on later on to say about the 30, and it says the best soldiers were, and you go through the list, and towards the end you hit this name right here, Uriah the Hittite. And now the story has just gotten a lot more complicated. You see, David knew Uriah. And then he played ignorant. Who's that over there? Who's that over there? And the servant's like, isn't that Bathsheba, Uriah's wife? Like, why are you asking me? You already know this. See, there's a lot of interesting things happening in the story, and we're never told how the people feel. For instance, throughout the story, it says repeatedly that David is trying to get Uriah to go back and sleep with Bathsheba so that he can just get out of jail free, right? And Uriah refuses to. And it brings up the question that is never answered. Does Uriah know? We don't know. It doesn't ever say what Uriah is thinking or what he's feeling. It doesn't say whether Bathsheba told him. It doesn't tell us anything. All that we know is that David is trying very, very hard to get himself out of a pickle that he just got himself into without doing the right thing. And so you have all these dramatic builds happening. And all along, David knew Uriah and he's playing ignorant, which probably means that he probably knew Bathsheba, at least in passing. You can't have 30 supreme warriors, the top of the top, that you yourself appointed, and be completely ignorant as to their family. Impossible. Impossible. You know what I mean? Take megachurch pastors. They have huge staffs on their church. Huge staffs. But they know the staff. And they at least know of their spouse. They might not know everybody in the congregation because it's just too big. But they do know all their staff. That's exactly what we're going on here. We're not saying that David knew everybody in Jerusalem. But I think he probably knew Bathsheba, at least in passing. And so then you have the probability, being a guy, I kind of am assuming this, I could be wrong, but there's a good probability that he was probably lusting after her before. What are the chances that he was just happened to be on the roof the same time she was bathing? Which brings up another question. Did she know that he was watching and doing it on purpose? See, there's a lot of things with the story that are not clarified. But what we do know is that David was doing something he shouldn't have been. So that brings us to the second problem that we see that comes up when loving people. The first one is that your confidence blinds you to who you are becoming. You stop trying to get closer to God. Oh, goodness sakes. You stop trying to get closer to God. You stop trying to learn. You stop trying to be a student of the Word because you know it all. You're already there. You don't need to grow. You're already there. The second problem that we see here with the story, the second problem that comes up with loving people is that competing loves come slowly. There's a song that my wife loves. It's by Casting Crowns, which I'm not a big fan of. But the song goes, it's a slow fade that happens. As Christians, there's a slow fade that comes. We're on fire for God one day, and then the next day we're just kind of, life hits. It's like I was talking with, I think it was Melissa, but you go to youth camp, you get all excited, right? 2 months later, you're not as excited anymore. You go to youth camp, I'm going to do this, I'm this, and this. You get back, and you don't stick with it. At least that's how I was. Maybe you guys were better than me, but I didn't. I never was able to stick with it. So we have here competing loves come slowly. You have to choose who you're going to love more, you or them. See, David had to make a choice. Who are you going to love, David? Who are you going to love? You're a man after God's own heart. Are you going to keep that title? Are you going to love you more, David, or are you going to love them more? Because make no mistake, he didn't sleep with Bathsheba because he was overwhelmed with love for her. He slept with Bathsheba because he was overwhelmed with love for himself. You cannot possibly have an affair, commit adultery, and then say, it was in their best interest. No, it was not. It was not. And I know we're masters of manipulating things to where we come out as a good person, but really you can't justify this. So Leviticus 19:18 says this. It says, love your neighbor as yourself. I'm the Lord. Now, there's a lot of talk nowadays about, love yourself, and then there's like the kind of Christian response of, no, you're not called to love yourself. Okay, here's the thing though. It's not about. Let me come back to that. I'll come back to that. So the problem that happened with David, where he slept with Bathsheba, it didn't start there. It didn't start in 2 Samuel chapter 11. It ended there. Okay, and why I say that is because few people cheat overnight. Sometimes it happens, but usually it builds. You start having a relationship with someone, just when it gets a little bit closer, then boundaries get ignored, then there's no accountability, then it gets closer. See what I mean? It builds. Things don't just happen overnight. You don't just wake up and say, oh, here's the wife that I love and I'm providing for her and everything, and then I'm going to go to work and I'm going to cheat on her. I mean, typically you don't do that. I mean, I imagine there are people out there that do that, but typically it doesn't happen like that. And the same thing happens when you go to a church. You're hurting at a church, right? You go there, you get your feelings hurt, somebody does something eventually that hurts your feelings, right? That's church. What are you going to do from there? Are you going to get bitter or are you going to forgive? Are you going to stop going or are you going to forgive? There's always this choice that comes up. And sometimes we allow our gossip and our hurt to get to such a point where we say stuff like this. Well, I just have to get it out. I just have to say it. If I say it, I'll feel better. No, you have to learn to control your mouth. That's gossip. There's no second way about it. If you always have to get something off your chest, that's gossip. You can't close your mouth. That's a problem. Because as we grow in Christ, he should have control of all of us. That means my lusts, my mouth, my finances, my life, all of me. It can't be like, well, God, you can have this area. That's not submission to the Lord. And when you hold back an area of your life, you find that you get more and more bitter. And that's exactly what David did, isn't it? He's holding back a piece of him. Even though he's a man after God's own heart, he's holding back a piece of him, and it builds to this. Because the truth is, if we can't get past people in the church, we won't reach people out there. If you are currently nursing a bad attitude towards anybody in this church, me or anybody else, I'm telling you, it's not going to just magically fix itself, and it will spread. You'd be surprised how many pastors I know who they had people who turned from big supporters to leaving the church and causing a whole scene when they left. You'd be very surprised how much it happens in churches. Somehow, there's just, you can't explain it other than this. Satan is at work in the church. That's the only way I can explain it. Because you see somebody who's loved God for years, been in the church for years, and then their heart just starts getting harder and harder and harder. And it's not just because you get older. Okay, I hear people say that. I know probably some of you are thinking it. Well, when you get older, no. It has nothing to do with age. Okay, I've seen people who are 90 years old that love people. I mean with a whole heart. I've seen people who are 90 years old who are more loving and serving than I'll probably ever be. I mean, it's not a thing about age. There's just something that happens where Satan sees an opening, and he'll seize it. And we forget that we're at war. We forget that because things are comfortable. And as long as things keep going my way, it's okay. But when somebody changes something, it hurts my feelings. Ooh, it's hard. It's hard because now it gets personal. This is your church, and somebody changed something. And it gets right. Am I wrong? You guys are looking at me like you don't know what I'm talking about. I've dealt with churches all over the state. This happens all over to churches all over, okay? This isn't like... It's probably going to happen here eventually too because it happens in all the other churches. When you allow something to get in your heart and you get all riled up and you won't forgive and you end up leaving the church. I remember there was this one, we'll never leave this church. Well, we've been in this church for years. We'll die in this church. They left the church. And then when they left poorly. You know what it means to leave poorly? You have to spread your hurt as much as you can before you go out the door. Get as many people on your side. You guys know. You guys have seen this before, right? Don't look at me like you don't know what I'm talking about. I've seen it many, many times in many different churches. And, it gets to a point where if you can't get past people in here, you aren't going to reach people out there. It will stop your evangelism. It will silence your ministry. I guarantee it. When you leave a church with a hurt attitude, it will squash your ministry in the future. It will. If you won't reach people out there, then you definitely won't invite people. And you only invite people if you love people. When you allow yourself as a Christian to get in a place of a hard heart, it's a domino effect, and it really has long impact. So love is definitely an action. We see that all throughout the Bible, but I think we see that here too, with the story with David and Bathsheba. Did David love Uriah? What do you guys think? Does anybody think that David loved Uriah? No. Nobody's raising their hand. Why don't you think he loved Uriah? Anybody? What? Because he betrayed him. He sent him to his death, and he had him carry his own death sentence. That's low. I mean, if you're going to kill a guy, kill a guy. But he sent the letter with the guy telling his commander to kill him. How low is that? I mean, goodness sakes, you could have at least said, hey, I slept with your wife. There's probably going to be consequences from this. But instead of that, instead of anything good, he decides, I'm going to send you with your own death certificate. That's fantastic. Just fantastic. Love is an action. We see that here. It doesn't matter what David felt for Uriah. It doesn't matter how much David was at war with how bad he felt for killing Uriah. Because at the end of the day, he showed his hate and his contempt for Uriah by sleeping with his wife and then killing him. Love is an action. It's always an action. When Christ loved us, he came and died. That is what love is. Love is not a feeling that we get, and we get flutters in our belly. That's great. Fantastic. You'll outgrow them. I promise you. They will not last longer than a couple years. It doesn't matter how strong your marriage is. They won't stay. It won't. It'll be over. But actions cannot just be lost. Oh, I fell out of love with my wife. Are you still buying her flowers? Are you still telling her you love her? Are you still writing her love poems? Are you still spending time with her? Are you still talking with her? Because it's going to be really hard to love someone if you aren't loving them. Am I right? Like, love is an action. We all know this. But for David, he just kind of lost sight of that. Love is an action. You shouldn't despise yourself. I'm not saying that when you... Because here's my take on this whole love yourself thing, okay? I'm not talking about that. That's it. That's my take on it. You shouldn't despise yourself. You shouldn't like wake up in the mirror and say, oh, I hate you. But we're not really talking about that. We're talking about how you treat people. Love yourself. Well, you already love yourself. You cater your life naturally to yourself. Love is an action. You might not feel good about yourself, but that's not loving yourself. That's more of just having insecurities. Love is an action, and so you have to show it to people, and you have to treat them with exception. Love your neighbor as yourself. Basically what that's saying, let me paraphrase that. Treat your neighbor well, how you are already taking care of yourself. Right? So we get to Philippians 2:3, and it says this, do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility consider others as more important than yourselves. Those are strong words. Love for people flows from true love for God. If you think you're a righteous person but you don't love, you're not a righteous person. Let's look at what 1 John 4:20 says. It says this. If anyone says, I love God, and yet hates his brother. Now, what does it mean to hate? This is exactly where we get the problem. This is where the problem comes from. Well, I don't have a bad attitude towards them. Hate is not an attitude any more than love is an attitude. Feelings of irritation come and go. Hate is how you treat them. If anyone says, I love God, and is treating their brother poorly, or sister, treating someone in the house of God poorly, he's a liar. You understand what it's saying? It's not saying you have to feel rosy towards people all the time. That's not what it's talking about. But when you go out of your way to gossip about somebody behind their back, that's hating them. When you go out of your way to talk down to somebody, that's hating them. When you go out of your way to do and serve, that's loving them. Because feelings will come and go. Always feelings come and go. If you think you're righteous but you don't have love, you are not righteous. It comes down to that. David hated Uriah. Not in feeling necessarily. He probably was real heartbroken over this, but in action, he hated him. And what does that tell us about David? It tells us that his relationship with God at this point is lacking. Because you cannot, in good measure, call yourself a Christian who loves God and treat people like this. You cannot do that in good conscience. You can't. So I don't know, call it backsliding, call it a rough patch, whatever it was, David's relationship was not good with God at this point. And it would have been very easy for David to justify himself. And I'll tell you exactly why. Did anybody already catch it, why it would be easy to justify David for what he did? See, I didn't notice this either until I was studying for this message. How does it introduce Uriah? Let's look at 11:3 again. Let's pay attention. So David sent someone to inquire about her, and he said, "Isn't this Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam and wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Now, some of your translations might say Hittite. It's a translational issue. Hittite is right. There's just been, in the past, historically, Hittites and Hittites were assumed to be one group of people. They're not the same group of people. You probably don't care, though. But if you do care, there's the answer. Two different people. It actually is Hittite. Hittite is the correct translation. Anyways, so here we have Uriah introduced not as David's friend. We don't have him introduced as Uriah, the worshiper of Yahweh. We have him introduced as the Hittite. Now, I'm assuming at this point, because it's easier to start here, let's just assume that nobody knows who Hittites are. Okay, let's just play dumb. Okay, if you do know who they are, just pretend like you don't. Huh? Who are the Hittites? The Hittites were a group of the Canaanites who God told Israel to go into the land and conquer the people, the Canaanites. Right? They were supposed to kill them off. The Hittites were one of those groups that were supposed to have been killed off. So it would have been very easy for David to have said something like this. Well, he's a Hittite anyways. He's an outsider anyways. See, for us, that wouldn't have been a thing. But remember, this isn't us. This is thousands of years ago in Israel. And they didn't have the whole Bible like we do. Okay, they had the law, which had some very strong things to say about the Canaanites. So that takes us to the third problem, the third battle that comes up in loving your neighbor. Bias. Bias prevents love by justifying selfishness. Bias tells you this: it's okay not to love them, because what about you? What about me? They're walking all over me. They're taking advantage of me. They're hurting my feelings. What about me? And bias will get you every time because it says, hey, it's okay that I don't love them because bias prevents love by justifying your selfishness. I remember when I was a worship pastor, it was okay that I was complaining and talking bad about the lead pastor. It was okay because I was more spiritual than him. Ever do that with your spouse? Well, you just don't get it like I do. I'm smarter than them. I'm a better Christian than them. I'm trying to make this marriage work. They're the one who's doing this. Don't look at me like you've never done that. I'm not the only person who thinks stupid stuff. You can't lie to me. But you get something in your head, and you have a way of justifying yourself when you really want to. Because bias prevents love by justifying your selfishness. We all have something called the funnel of ministry, and I have a diagram, guys. See that? A diagram. How cool is that? I have a diagram. This is the funnel of ministry. It looks a lot like a triangle, doesn't it? That's because it is a triangle. I'm not good enough with these kinds of things to make an actual funnel-looking thing, so we're just going with a triangle. Just pretend. Use your imagination. Imagination. We all have a funnel of ministry that shrinks with each group that we refuse to serve well. So at the top of the funnel, top of the funnel, this would be the people who Jesus loves. At the bottom, these are the people who we actually reach. Because we go through all these checks of people that we don't like talking to. Okay? So here's some examples that I come across quite frequently. Homosexuals, adulterers, exes. Oh man, you see people who get divorced, they have a hard attitude towards their divorcee. Here's my thinking on that. If you're going to get a divorce, you might as well forgive them because you don't have to live with them anymore. Why hold on to the bitterness and hurt? Why do that? You're just going to be hurt for the rest of your life. I mean, surely there's got to be an easier way to live. But here's that. Okay, so we got X's. People are too young. People are too old. People have been divorced. People are Democrats. People are Republicans. What if Jesus hadn't served well? What if Jesus had his own funnel that he limited it down with? And we justify it very good. It's okay that I don't love this group of people because I'm sure we all have our own different excuses, but they just gross me out. Or they're just obviously immoral people. Well, okay. But, in God's eyes, there's two groups of people. There's saved and there's not saved. That's it. That's it. See, we get real hung up on other details. The place that I moved from, there was a lot of racism going on between the natives and the Hispanics and a little bit the whites, but mostly it was this whole big thing going on between the natives and the Hispanics. Man, it was like a blood feud. I mean, they were just after each other's throats. It was very difficult to do ministry because you had to always take into account, this is going to kind of blow up in our face, and this, oh my goodness. So you had to try and reach people without them coming and starting a fight amongst themselves. It was very, very difficult to do that. But, you make it work. But my point being, there's always these people that we're not okay with. It can be a race thing, it can be a class thing, it can be a political thing. There's lots of different reasons why we do it. It can be a sin thing. It really doesn't matter. At the end of the day, we have these different excuses for why it's okay for our funnel to get smaller. Most of us, if I were to ask for a raise of hands, I'm not going to do that. But most of us, if I were to ask, how many of you are active friends with homosexuals right now? Most people would not raise their hands. Well, okay, I said don't raise your hand. But most people in the church aren't going to raise their hand. Why? Because we just don't. We know that it's an immoral thing. It's a sin. So we think, everybody's a sinner in need of grace. Like, it's not. You can't pick and choose who the ministry field is. Roswell, that's the ministry field. This building this is not church. We are having a service. Church is when we go out there. Does that make sense? We're just having a service here. We're focusing on God. Church is when we go out there. We're going out into the mission field. There's actually a church I know of. I wish I could remember which one it is. It doesn't matter. They have over their doors as you walk out, you are now entering the mission field. I like that. That's good. So we still have one last very important missing piece to the story of David and Bathsheba. And to this day, every time that I hear somebody talk about David and Bathsheba, they never once bring up this very important detail. It's in the chapter before. Look at this. Okay? 2 Samuel chapter 10. Sometime later, the king of the Ammonites died, and his son Hanun became king in his place. Then David said this, I'll show kindness to Hanun, son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me. So David sent his emissaries to console Hanun concerning his father. However, when they arrived in the land of the Ammonites, remember that, the Ammonites, the Ammonite leader said to Hanun, their lord, just because David has sent men with condolences for you, do you really believe he's showing respect for your father? Instead, hasn't David sent his emissaries in order to scout out the city, spy on it, and demolish it? So Hanun took David's emissaries, shaved off half their beards, cut their clothes in half at the hips, and sent them away. So you've got your faces looking kind of, the Jews had a whole thing with their beard, that's gone, and then you have their butts hanging out. When this was reported to David, he sent someone to meet them since they were deeply humiliated. Yeah, I'd be deeply humiliated too, I think. And I don't even have the whole Jewish thing with my beard, and I still would be humiliated. The king said, stay in Jericho until your beards grow back, then return. Just stay where you are, it's fine. Just stay there. When the Ammonites realized they had become repulsive to David, that word, when they realized they had become repulsive, what did you think was going to happen? What? When's the last time somebody's come to your house and you've shaved out their beard and stripped their clothes and sent them back home and you were surprised that they were repulsed? Anyways, they hired 20,000 foot soldiers from the Arameans of Beth Rehob and Zobah, 1,000 men from the king of Makkah, and 12,000 men from Tob. Now look at this. When the Arameans saw that they had been defeated, this is down in verse 15, by Israel, they regrouped. Hadadezer sent messengers to bring the Arameans who were beyond the Euphrates River, and they came to Halam with Shebek, commander of Hadadezer's army, leading them. And then we get to chapter 11, which is never once connected with people nowadays. This is a very important point. In the spring, when kings march out to war the same year, the spring of the same year, now we're in war season, David sent Joab with all his officers and all Israel to go fight the battle. Instead of going himself, instead of leading, just sending somebody else to do the work. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. Who were they going to fight against? The Ammonites. Who, in the previous chapter, was David trying to console? The Ammonites. This is an extremely important point, and I'll kind of break down why it's important. Because David was trying to do the right thing, it blows up in his face, and then he withdrew because he got hurt. Okay, let me tell you a story. We, in Tularosa is what we call a druggy community. Everybody there does drugs. It's not like a euphemism of everybody. I mean, literally everybody. Like, there's probably like maybe 20% of the population that doesn't. Everybody there does drugs. And so we had this idea, a very good idea. It wasn't mine. It was actually the lead pastor's. I thought it was a great idea to start a men's center to help their sons, not our sons, their sons, get off of drugs. It wasn't it wasn't a halfway house. It was a men's center. So people who were ready to get off of drugs and change their life, basically Teen Challenge. Okay, so we weren't just going to take people in. We weren't going to just have a bunch of problem people. People who are ready to leave the drugs behind and change their life. People who are ready. It would point them to Christ, help them to grow as disciples, get them involved in ministry, and send them back out. It was a fantastic idea. There was all kinds of stuff. I mean, really, the pastor outdid himself. But oh boy, things just started going from bad to worse. A board member started going behind the senior pastor's back and having meetings with people in the city against what the pastor was leading them towards. Now, you might say, oh, well, how could he? You'd be surprised how easy it is to justify something in the heat of the moment. You'd be surprised. So this board member starts getting stuff, and he starts having secret meetings with one of the state officers, state police. And the state police officer goes and he starts stirring people up in the community off hours while still using his badge. He got in huge trouble for that, but the damage was done. We had a community meeting, and oh my goodness, have you guys ever seen the Disney cartoon Beauty and the Beast? Everybody's seen that, right? That's old enough. I feel like everybody's seen that. There's this part at the end where Gaston, the man's man, where he sees in the magical mirror the beast. And so he riles up the whole community, kill the beast! Kill the beast! And so they're all going off to war to fight some beast that it's not bothering them at all, but he's riled them all up. That's exactly what happened. It was like we were having this community meeting, and it was just like that scene was getting played out over again. And I almost laughed because of how tragic this whole thing went. Their sons are the ones on drugs, and they're all yelling at us. The whole thing blew up. And they're all, you're going to bring drugs into Tularosa? And I said, what? Your sons are drug addicts. They're selling drugs to these guys' sons over here. What are you talking about? It's not going to bring drugs in. We're going to help people who are on drugs to no longer be on drugs. What are you talking about? It blew up. Man, I tell you what. And here's the thing that happened. This is how it ties into the story of David and Bathsheba. As leaders, we dropped the ball. We dropped it. Because we got our feelings hurt. See, it's easy to say, let's start a men's center. It's hard when there's so many rumors going around and your church is getting so much flack. When state officers are willing to break the law to go and disrupt what you're doing, the whole thing went bad fast. I mean, it just went bad from worse, and we got our feelings hurt. So we dropped it. A couple of years. A couple of years after that, there was this guy that lived in the apartments next to us. And COVID hit,
And he never got the help that he needed. And he ended up committing suicide because he was just too lonely. I don't know how it hit Roswell, but the whole stay-at-home thing, it screwed Tularosa up. I mean, you had people turning suicidal. The whole community fell apart. I don't know how Roswell did, but we didn't do good out there. And this guy, he could have had the chance. But we dropped it because we got our feelings hurt. And this is the same thing we do as Christians. This is the same thing David and Bathsheba did. It hurt too bad, so we just backed off. And that brings us to the fourth problem that comes up when it's time to love people. Your pain threshold determines how much you love. Your pain threshold determines how much you love. We weren't willing to go through the pain. It hurt too bad. Everything blew up in our faces. Just like David. He wasn't willing to go to war, was he? But he was willing to send somebody else to go to war. Because he was too hurt. Why did David stay in Jerusalem? Because his feelings were hurt. It's better to just stay here where it's safe. Let somebody else go fight the battle. And later on in the story, Joab actually sends him a letter and says, look, if you don't get your butt out here, people are going to, your soldiers are going to start having a riot. And they're going to start exalting me in the situation. You need to come out here so you can claim the city. And it can be said that David conquered the city and not Joab. You need to get your act in order. And he was right. Your pain threshold always determines how much you love. If you want to love people more, go through more pain. Raise how much pain you're willing to go through. Sam Chand actually has an entire book about this called Leadership Pain. So David got hurt and got kind of burnt out. I'm done with this. So then he isolated himself. Never a good idea. And so because he isolated himself, he put himself in a really bad situation. He put himself in a really bad situation. And because he put himself into a really bad situation, he faced unnecessary temptation. Temptation he didn't have to deal with if he wouldn't have withdrawn from his hurt. And the temptation that was used, that was just something that happened from his past, that when he had a divided heart. See, from the days of his wandering in the desert, he had a divided heart that grew and grew and grew. So then when the opportunity presented itself and he isolated himself and got his feelings all hurt, the sin was just, it was going to happen. It was bound to happen. You can't get your feelings hurt and isolate yourself and pull back and then be surprised when you get yourself into a place of acting like that. Do you think that board member was always like that? No, I don't think so. I think he was genuinely Christian at one point. But things happened. He got hurt. He withdrew, and then the opportunity presented itself, and he turned, and the whole thing turned. He was probably at one time a good board member, I imagine. Of course, I don't know that. I'm just assuming, I guess. Pastors and leaders, oftentimes we get hurt, and then we withdraw, and we stay in our offices, and we have everybody else go out and do the things, but we're never in the front of the army. It happens all the time. It happened in Alamogordo. Well, I probably shouldn't mention that, though. So, it's something that we all as leaders have to do. And here's something I learned that's a hard pill to swallow, but I hope that you can learn from it, okay? As Christians, you have to learn to prioritize people. There are some people you have to get distance from. As pastors, you also have to learn who to pastor. Because some people, and I hear what I'm saying, they're unpastorable. They are not willing to submit themselves to the authority of the church. They want to go and cause problems, and then when you want to resolve it, they just do whatever they want. They're unpastorable. So as a pastor, this is what we typically do. We waste all of our time on the couple people who are causing problems. Whether they say the squeaky wheel gets the grease, we focus all of our attention on that. And so what that leaves us with is it leaves us very tired, and they end up leaving anyways. And then the people who need the pastor, they get neglected because we're spending all of our time and energy on people who don't want to change. And when you say it like that, this is what people always say, that's so cruel and harsh. Everybody has to learn this lesson eventually. You as just because you aren't the pastor doesn't mean you don't have to learn it. There's going to be people you're going to have to distance yourself from because they're always gossiping, they're always talking bad, and they call themselves a Christian, but then they want to act like that. And you have to distance yourself from them. It's a hard lesson. But maybe a couple examples. When you've got people that can't control their mouth, they're always saying something, okay, they shouldn't be in leadership. Everybody knows this, but then whenever you say it, they act like, huh? I mean, imagine this. Would you be okay with the pastor talking about you guys behind your back? Well, no. So why would any leader have a place being a leader when they act like that? It's not just that, though. What about when you have a bad volunteer? In Christians, we're renowned. I mean, in churches, we are renowned for having volunteers that do a bad job continue to volunteer. Well, they're never on time. They don't do a good job. They're always in a bad mood, but we're lucky to have them. No, you aren't. You're not lucky to have them. They're ruining the whole team, and they're making it where other people won't volunteer because they don't want to work with that person. It actually shoots yourself in the foot. When you have a bad volunteer, what do? You don't use them. When you have someone that's divisive, what do? You don't keep giving them all your time. You don't. You give people as a pastor your time who need it and who want it. When I first came here, Thurman was very lonely. He was very old. I started out first, going and meeting with him every single week because I didn't think he had real long and he needed somebody there. When I came here, there was also some people who thought that I needed to be involved in different problems, and I was just like, look, we're not doing that. And then I moved on. Because there's been a problem that's been going on since Settle was here. Well, Settle's dead. Rick's gone. Now it's me. I'm not going to keep going on the same problem over and over again. You guys ever been that? Your kids just refuse to listen? You keep going over and over with it? And as Christians, we have to learn this because here's the thing. When you love Roswell, when you go out and serve Roswell, this is my point in saying all this, there are going to be battles that you have to fight, just like David had to fight, of whether you will love them or not. And then there will be some people who it will not work. You will not be able to witness to them. And you can't just keep throwing yourself up against a brick wall. Go and find those who will listen. What did Jesus say? He said when you're going throughout the towns, if somebody rejects you, just keep on going. Because there's other people out there who could still hear. They could still be saved. Don't waste all your time. Keep throwing the same message at the same brick wall. Right? Everybody knows this from the Bible, but yet we fail to apply it when it comes to church situations. So God wants us to love Roswell. We're getting ready to wrap up here. God wants us to love Roswell. We will be attacked both in the church and in the community. The reason why we're not having internal squabbles right now, because we aren't reaching people right now. When we start reaching people, watch. You're gonna have all kinds of opportunities to be offended. There's gonna be new people who come in. They're gonna hurt your feelings. It happens when a church is growing. It's easier when a church is not growing. And this is what the Bible says about that. Let's see if I can quote it right. Where the oxen are, I'm gonna paraphrase. I can't remember exactly where it is or how it is. It's in Proverbs. I can't remember exactly how it's worded. Basically, oxen make a lot of mess, but there's a lot of work that's achieved by them. It's easier to have a small church because we can just be a close-knit group and just shut out the outsiders. It's harder to be a church that reaches people because you get kids coloring on the walls with crayons. You get people talking on their phone in the middle of the service. We had one person at this one church. This was really funny. And she would sit at the very back of the church, and she would answer phone calls during the service. Oh, man, oh, man, oh, man. Anyways, and you'll be attacked in the community as well. We faced a little bit of that with the Rudoso situation, but we'll probably face a lot more than what we faced. If you withdraw when you are hurt, it'll only get worse, though. I mean, think about the different situations in life. You have a death of a loved one. When you withdraw, it's going to get worse. You go through a nasty divorce. You withdraw, it's going to get worse. You get sudden health problems. You withdraw, it's going to get worse. Somebody betrays you. You withdraw, it's going to get worse. It's never going to end any better by withdrawing. You have to push forward. You have to forgive. You have to choose to keep on living. And that brings us to the 4 things here. 4 keys to love people. First off, be diligent. Be diligent. Satan will keep you too busy to love God and people more today. He'll keep you too busy. You got too much stuff going on. David was not diligent in the day-to-day. He was not. Number 2, go love them. Loving Roswell is very inconvenient. It doesn't happen on our clock. It doesn't, right? Things happen all the time. It's never convenient to serve them. Man, oh man, I was having a near heart attack, having a first responder thing while there's all this stuff going on in Verdoso, oh man, talk about hectic. I mean, you guys really pulled together, and you pulled it through. I mean, it wasn't me. I was like, ah. If there wouldn't have been so many fantastic volunteers, man, that thing would not have worked out well. What are the odds? Tell me, what are the odds that happened right at the same time that the fire was going on? Like, what are the odds of that? Goodness sakes. But anyways, so loving Roswell is never inconvenient. Jesus spent his time in ministry only ever on Sunday in the synagogue. Or actually, it would be Saturday in the synagogue. No. Jesus, most of the time that he's doing miracles, he's out in the streets, not in the four walls. Go out, live your life, invite people out there. Being a church, going to church is what you do out there. And we see that with David. David betrayed his brother. I mean, let's be honest, it was his brother. Then the third thing, the third key to love people, love your unlovable. Now, I can't answer that for you. You are the only person who can answer that. Everybody has somebody who's unlovable to them. You have to love the person who's unlovable to you. You will never love those people that you look down on. You will always overlook their needs. For instance, I have a little bit of a problem with people who are unemployed by choice. When you're just too lazy to get up off your butt and work. I have a problem with that. I don't talk about it a whole lot because I don't want my bias to affect you guys. However, it does still bother me. If you are physically able to work and you sit there and have everybody else spoon feed you, that's a little bit ridiculous. And I see this a lot in Tularosa where the man of the house was at home playing video games while the wife is going and doing all the paperwork. It's just, this is not good. That's just not good. Anyways, I'm getting off on a rabbit trail here, so let me get back in here. There's always going to be somebody who is unlovable to you. And you know exactly who it is, the people who you overlook, the people you despise. And the reason why is because you don't look how to serve people that you can't stand. And we see that with David. He had a disdain for Uriah, a disdain for him by how he treated him. The fourth and final key that I think we can see from David and Bathsheba to love people, because it is going to be a battle to love people. You're not just going to be like, hey, I feel great all the time. I always feel like witnessing. I always feel like, no, it's not going to happen. The fourth and final thing, raise your pain threshold. Raise how much pain you're willing to go through. Everybody wants a change. Listen to me on this, okay? We're wrapping things up here. Everybody wants a change. Everybody does. Don't you want things to change in the nation? Don't you want things to change in your family? Don't you want things to change in your job? Everybody wants a change. It's harder to be the change. Infinitely harder. It's much easier to say, man, the church isn't loving people. The church isn't serving people how they should. I'm not willing to try something new, but I think they should try something new. It's easier to be like David, where he locked himself away in his castle and said, hey, you go fight my battle for me. You go do that. I'm not willing to do it myself. And you find people who are the most critical and always shoot down the ideas are oftentimes the last people to give an alternative option. Oh, that'll never work, Pastor. Okay, so what you got? Oh, I don't know. Well, we got to try something. Today, who is there to love and serve today? Today, who is being overlooked in Roswell? Today, how are you fighting the battle to love and serve Roswell? Not how is the church, how are you personally fighting the battle? Are you doing well or are you not doing well? What needs to change? Is church a place that you are going or is it a life that you're living? Is it a place you're going or is it a life that you're living? Lord, I thank you for your word. I thank you for the examples that you give us with David, that we can learn from them and we can learn new ways to love and serve Roswell, to reach out to the people, to do things we haven't done before, or maybe things that have failed in the past and we'll try them again. Maybe things that were successful in the past that won't be successful now, but we're still going to try it. Help us to see the needs, help us to see the hurting, and help us never, ever, ever to forget where we came from. God, that we wouldn't look on people with disdain. We wouldn't look on people with hardness in our heart. Lord, help us not to glory in who we were, but rather to glory in who you are and let you change our hearts. Lord, I need my heart changed every day. I need you more. Like just like that song says, Lord, I need you more than yesterday. I need you more, God. Yesterday wasn't enough. I can't live on yesterday's anointing. I can't live on yesterday's word from God. I can't live on yesterday's direction. I can't live on yesterday's title. God, we need you now today. God, we need you now today.